Hello, everybody. This is Miss Brett. We are going to move along into our next topic, which is Block 3 of Unit 2. So with Block 3, we are calling this the Restoration Colonies and Georgia. So we're going to talk about this last group of colonies to complete the 13 colonies, which will also include Georgia, and we'll talk about why Georgia is in parentheses like that. So we've already talked about the Chesapeake colonies, which remember included Virginia and Maryland, highly reliant on tobacco, the use of indentured servants. We then talked about the New England region and how New England was specifically formed for Puritans who were fleeing England and the Anglican Church. And with the New England colonies starting out with Plymouth and Massachusetts with very strict Puritan ideology, anyone who questioned the church or questioned the faith ended up being banished. And that's how New England then spread to Rhode Island and also Connecticut and New Hampshire. So now we're into the last phase and finalizing the 13 colonies, which we call the Restoration Colonies. Now, with the Restoration Colonies, we do not see colonies being founded after Maryland for about 30 years. We get Virginia, we get Plymouth, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and then Maryland gets founded in 1632. And after that, we don't have another colony in the English Americas for over 30 years. So some historical context as to why it took so long for more colonies to develop is all because of the English Civil War. Now, you may recall from the New England lecture, King Charles I was very pro-Catholic, very harsh towards the Puritans, and with King Charles, he ends up getting pretty autocratic. He ended up dissolving Parliament, and it ended up becoming a civil war between the monarchy and basically representation. Now, as a civil war takes place, it's impossible for a country to focus on exploration when they're dealing with, in the middle of this civil war, this conflict. So by the time the Civil War is coming to an end, which ends up with the beheading of King Charles, we end up seeing this event causing a delay in English colonization. Now, when King Charles was beheaded, the throne took quite a bit of turn. This is when, you may recall, like Oliver Cromwell came in to kind of protect the English monarchy and protect the order of the English government. And so it took some time before we actually had the throne restored, which may be a reason why it's called the Restoration Colonies. So the English Civil War is going to cause this gap with English colonization. And now we're going to talk about the Restoration Colonies and the Stuart Restoration. Now, with the Stuart Restoration, after King Charles was beheaded, we had this transition period with Oliver Cromwell. The Stuart Restoration did return. We did see a return to the monarchy. Now, King Charles' son, King Charles II, is going to come to power. So the English literally beheaded his father, and now they ask if he wants to take the throne. And he does. So with King Charles II taking on the Stuart Restoration, coming into power, kind of having to restore the English monarchy and the English throne, he is going to push for what's called the Restoration Colonies. So the Restoration Colonies, which is going to pretty much finalize our 13 colonies, the reason they get called the Restoration Colonies is kind of for two reasons. King Charles II wants to restore the English reputation. He wants to restore the English throne. He wants to basically create an empire that has respect and legitimacy for his reign. So that's kind of why Restoration Colonies get the name. But he's going to end up, all the Restoration Colonies are going to be proprietary colonies. Remember that term proprietary colony is the giving of land to a friend, right? With the Restoration Colonies, they will all be proprietary colonies. He is going to give colonies to his friends that were faithful during the Civil War, that were loyal during the conflict that involved the beheading of his father. So restoration colonies, we're going to see the restoration of the throne, restoring the English Empire, and all of the restoration colonies are going to be proprietary, given to his friends, his allies, his loyal followers. Okay, so we're going to start with the middle region. Oh, sorry, here is King Charles II. Quite the hairdo, right? So with how we're going to divide today up, we're going to start with the middle colonies and talk about New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Okay, this region that is separating the English in New England and the English in the Chesapeake. So we're going to start with the middle colonies, and then we're going to talk about the southern colonies. Okay. So moving along, let's talk about the middle region, the 4 colonies in the middle, and talk about the foundations first of New York and New Jersey. So remember I said restoration colonies are all proprietary colonies. So New York and New Jersey, the proprietor, the friend who gets this land, is actually King Charles II's little brother. So the proprietor that's going to rule New York and New Jersey is the little brother of King Charles II. Okay. He is James, who will actually end up taking the throne eventually. But James is also, his title is the Duke of York. So some names there that should be you should recognize. So with New York and New Jersey, the proprietor that will be in charge is King Charles II's little brother, James, and his title is the Duke of York. So remember in England, those laws of primogeniture where the second eldest, doesn't inherit. So this is his opportunity to get land and to rule and to have some ownership. So when the Duke of York, the little brother James, went to this region, it was already controlled by the Dutch. And this was a problem because the Dutch controlled this region, and it was called New Amsterdam. So kind of looking back at our map, with the Dutch being in this region, James, the Duke of York, is going to see this as a problem and want to basically remove the Dutch from the region. Now, with that being said, the Dutch didn't really put up much of a fight. The Dutch didn't have as much of an investment and as much of a profit coming from the colonies. So this ends up leading to a settlement called the Articles of Capitulation. Now, the Articles of Capitulation, basically, the Dutch surrendered the territory. The Dutch gave the land to the English. But the English are going to allow all the colonists to remain. So the Dutch will surrender the territory to the English, and the English will allow all of the existing people to stay. Now, with the Articles of Capitulation, because of that, because the English are going to let everyone stay, the characteristics of New York and New Jersey are going to be very interesting. So let's talk about some of the characteristics of New York and New Jersey. So without a doubt, once the Dutch surrender the territory and we see that the colonists can stay, the number one characteristic you need to know about New York and New Jersey is that they are going to be the most diverse colonies out of the English colonies. And the whole reason is because the Dutch allowed anyone to really come. They had freedom of religion and so forth. So we don't not only see Dutch and English, but we're also going to see Germans, we're going to see French, we're going to see Scandinavians, we're going to see Indians, lots of different groups that were allowed to live there, causing New York and New Jersey to become the most diverse colonies. So New York City is one of the most diverse cities in the country. Houston actually just bypassed New York last year. So this starts as the most diverse, and it remained the most diverse up until 2019. And so with that being said, the fact that it's very diverse is pretty much the biggest characteristic you need to know. The other interesting characteristic about the Duke of York is that he refused to allow a representative body. Another characteristic, the Duke of York refused to allow a representative body. Now think about that. Why was he so scared of representation? Virginia had the House. All of the colonies at this point have a representative body. Why did the Duke of York refuse to have representation? Think about what happened to his father. King Charles dissolved Parliament, had a civil war, and then they beheaded him. So he's a little afraid and apprehensive about representation. And so this is going to cause him to be reluctant and not allow representative bodies in New York and New Jersey. So with that being said, eventually they will get them after the Duke of York is no longer around. But those are just some of the main characteristics about these regions. Now, New Jersey was basically created into its own colony. And New Jersey, while it was governed the same way, it was very diverse as well. It never really grew a very large city or a very large high upper class. And it's kind of true to this day that New Jersey never developed a big city, because the big city of New Jersey is New York. New York City, the island, is right there on New Jersey. And so the city's always seen as New York. And I lived in New Jersey. I was born there. And anytime someone said they're going to the city, it was always New York. So we definitely see a very diverse region ruled by the little brother of the king. And it's going to have some more control because of that. So now we're going to turn our attention to the next group in the middle colonies, which will involve Pennsylvania and Delaware. And with Pennsylvania, you absolutely have to know this man here, William Penn, who is going to be a Quaker. So if you are ever in the grocery store and you scrolled through the cereal aisle and you see Quaker Oats, you should recognize this man. He is the face of Quaker Oats. So William Penn and the Quakers, basically William Penn, before we talk about what the Quakers are and who the Quakers are, William Penn first was a person who King Charles II owed him money. And so King Charles II, instead of paying him back, just said, hey, here, take this land. You can be the proprietor and you have access to it. So with William Penn, he ends up getting access to creating the colony in 1681, where he is going to be the proprietor. Okay. And now with that being said, he is a Quaker. So let's talk about who the Quakers are and what the Quakers are. The Quakers are also known as the Society of Friends. I know, it seems like it's our first hippies, and wait till you hear some of their beliefs. The Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers, were basically a Protestant group that rejected predestination. So within England, they're not Puritans. They reject that notion of predestination. It's another group that has evolved from English Protestants. So with the Quakers and William Penn and these beliefs, they've definitely had a lot more liberal ideologies that were pretty open and pretty shocking for this time period. For one, they believed that women were equal to men. Okay, big shocking thing to say at this time. They also really believed in equality as far as like leadership. They really didn't like the idea of leaders, kind of that idea of having that hierarchy. And another major characteristic of the Quakers is that they are pacifists, meaning that they refuse to fight. So if they refuse to fight, think about how that's going to actually have some interesting relations with the Native Americans. Okay. So with our Society of Friends, just some of the big characteristics about them. Women were equal to men. They really were against like having a set of leaders, like a hierarchy system, and they were pacifists. They did not believe in conflict. So when William Penn was granted this territory, and he formed the colony of Pennsylvania, and then eventually Delaware, he called it the Holy Experiment. Now, with it being the Holy Experiment, he basically wanted to create a colony that was free of persecution, free of fighting, that really welcomed everyone. It was open. He really believed in freedom of all religions, and he wanted to plan this holy experiment where it was accepting, right? It was accepting of others. They respected the natives. They actually compensated the Native Americans for the land. Okay. They actually paid the Native Americans for this territory, showing a lot of respect. Again, showing kind of that lack of fighting. They're not going to fight for the land, they're going to pay for it. And so, with that being said, the holy experiment, we see some interesting characteristics where we seem like it's open, there's not hierarchy. But one thing that was interesting about the holy experiment is that William Penn refused to have a representative assembly. So, just like the Duke of York, Penn is not going to allow a representative body. Now, with that being said, he is going to eventually concede. Again, he really doesn't like that idea of hierarchy, which he believed this created. But eventually, he is going to secede and allow a representative body to take place. And this is actually why Delaware got created. Delaware kind of split off from people who wanted to have a representative body. Although William Penn governed both, Delaware split because they wanted representative bodies. So eventually, Pennsylvania will also get the representative assembly, but it's definitely, we're seeing after the English Civil War, there's this kind of tension or mistrust of the representative assemblies. Now, with that also being said, with the holy experiment, with the creation of Philadelphia, which becomes the big city in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia was nicknamed the city of brotherly love, and that is still what it is called today. However, if you're wearing a Cowboys jersey and you go to Philadelphia, I promise you, you will not feel like you're in the city of brotherly love. With Philadelphia, though, the reason why we see this planned is it was really a planned community. This is where we start to see like cities being formed into gridlocks. And honestly, it looks like we could be looking at downtown Austin right now, right? With all the cross streets and the numbered streets, it creates like a gridlock. And so we see that with William Penn and with his holy experiment, it really was about creating this society that was open for everyone, but also like experimenting if it works. And so I always like to show Pennsylvania because this is really going to be the kind of the stepping stone, the example that other big cities are going to use when actually creating them. So with that being said, with William Penn and the Quakers. Unfortunately, William Penn eventually was imprisoned in England for debt. He ended up dying in poverty, even though when he came to the New World and established Pennsylvania, had successful colonies. Unfortunately, William Penn's destiny ended up in failure. But Pennsylvania is going to be one of the more prosperous colonies. Their very mild climate and very rich soil is going to allow for a lot of great crops to be grown. A lot of food is going to be grown in Pennsylvania. And so I like to show this quote from William Penn, where he wrote in 1701, "Because no people can be truly happy, though under the greatest enjoyments of civil liberties, if abridged of the freedom of their conscience as to their religious profession and worship." Basically saying that people are truly happy with these civil liberties and freedoms. So I always like to show this painting and kind of compare this to other colonies that we saw so far. So this painting by Edward Hicks is called The Peaceable Kingdom. Okay. Now this was painted way later than when the colony was founded in 1681, but this is showing William Penn with Native Americans. Okay. Over here, think about how William Penn was a pacifist. He refused to fight. He paid the natives for their land, right? And then we also have a lot of symbolism of like the lion sitting down with the sheep, right? Like this idea that there can be peace, there can be differences and live together. So I want you to think about when we talked about Winthrop and his city upon a hill. Winthrop said, we have to all be one. We have to all be knit together. We all have to do the same. And if we don't, we fail. And we saw in the city upon a hill that when people didn't do and didn't follow and they questioned, like Thomas Hooker and Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, when they didn't follow the strict orderly conduct, they got kicked out. William Penn, though, is saying that he's welcoming differences. He's welcoming different religions and the idea that women are equal. And so showing very drastic differences between the different colonies in the Americas. So that gets us through New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And so with the finalization of the Restoration colonies, we're going to go to the South. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Carolinas. The Carolinas are the last of the Restoration colonies. So Carolinas, again, Restoration, they are proprietary colonies. But originally, this colony was just Carolina. Okay. King Charles II gave Carolina to 8 proprietors. So King Charles II is going to give Carolina to 8 proprietors. Now, originally, this land, this Carolina colony, was going to go from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. See why they need 8 proprietors to govern? Now, think about why in the world would King Charles II want a colony that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean? What's his motive? What is he trying to do? When you think about it, think about who's south, right? Who is south of the Carolinas, and the Spanish Empire definitely being in the back of the mind of King Charles II about what is their intention. Are they going to expand? Are they going to, run into the English? And is that going to lead to a conflict? Now, with that being said, Carolina never actually got to the Pacific. That was very ambitious. It was more of a act, more of a symbol of what the English were attempting, but it never actually really happened. So Carolina, though, is given to these 8 proprietors, and the whole plan was for profit. The Carolinas were all about mercantilism, plan for profit. We're going to definitely see the idea of, head right system being enforced, giving people land, giving just an incentive for settlers to go to the Carolinas and produce. We definitely will see representative assemblies start off right away in the Carolinas. So there will be representation, not so much of that fear that exists in the Carolinas. And the plan for profit is really going to start off with a lot of food stuff. There's going to be sugar plantations. We're also going to see lots of rice. Rice is going to be a major crop in the Carolinas as well. So let's talk about why the Carolinas end up splitting between the North and the South. Well, North Carolina is right on the border of Virginia. It's right on the southern border of Virginia. And North Carolina ended up basically being populated by a lot of Englishmen who had no rights to that land. A lot of them were freed indentures. A lot of them were just low class, trying to find a way to make money. Today we would call these people squatters, right? They had no right to the land. They were just using it and taking advantage of it. So North Carolina was definitely much more of a lower class society. South Carolina, though, ended up having a very large port in Charlestown. Charleston, which we call now, was originally Charlestown, named after King Charles II. And Charleston became a big port where the big trade was happening in the Caribbean and like Barbados. And so South Carolina had a very big planter class, an elite class, and definitely that wealthy society in South Carolina wanted nothing to do with the people in the North. So they eventually called for the king to split, and in 1729, we end up having North and South Carolina. So with the Carolinas, again, most of it's about profit, and some of it is about trying to intimidate, or at least that whole idea of spreading to the Pacific was to try to make sure that the Spanish didn't expand north, which leads us to our 13th colony, Georgia. Now, Georgia is not considered a restoration colony because it was so late. It's the last one. Georgia is simply going to be ended up creating because the big need for Georgia was military. The big need for Georgia is going to be military. Now, when you look at our map of this time, think about who's down here in Florida, right? The Spanish are in Florida. And we have the Carolinas right here. So there's this little room, this buffer zone, that what if the Spanish decide to expand? What if the Spanish decide to move north? So Georgia is created as this buffer zone in between the South Carolina and Florida territory. It's mainly there to basically prevent or defend the colonies. They're there to make sure that the Spanish don't expand. So with that being said, the big need for Georgia is to defend the colonies. Okay. Now, the person who gets basically chosen to be like the governor of Georgia is actually a general named James Oglethorpe. And the General James Oglethorpe is a military general. He is going to organize, and he is going to train, and he is going to prepare troops to live in Georgia just in case there is Spanish tension or expansion into the north. So with James Oglethorpe, he was extremely strict. There were a lot of rules in Georgia. For one, he refused to allow any African colonists at all. Whether they were slaves or free, no Africans can live in Georgia. He really believed that that could lead to revolts, or that the Spanish could influence the Africans to be allies. He did not allow anyone of African descent to be in Georgia. He also prohibited any alcohol. And at this time, because sugar was so prosperous, sugar gets turned into rum, and rum was really the number one alcoholic drink. And he prevented any rum to be consumed or purchased. He really wanted to set a strict standard of morality. And he also excluded Catholics. Again, think about the fact that the Spanish are in Florida, the Spanish are Catholic. He was afraid of any sort of ties or alliances being produced. So very strict customs, very strict rules in Georgia. However, you have to now think, who in the world is going to go to Georgia, right? Like, who is going to opt into this lifestyle? Who's actually going to be enlisting in the military and defending the English colonies? And he basically recruits a lot of people who are in debt. Kind of like, if you serve, then your debts will be forgiven. Definitely a lot of people who were poor, looking for opportunity or looking for jobs, that went to Georgia. But Georgia's going to have the smallest population out of all the English colonies, and a lot of it is because of these very strict rules. Now, eventually, because Georgia was struggling, their population was super low, which also caused their economy to be just nothing. James Oglethorpe is going to end up lifting a lot of the rules, and we're going to see populations start to spread into Georgia that aren't just there for the military. We'll see some land, especially new fertile land, is going to be a great way to incentivize people to come into the colony and cultivate crops. So to finish today, I want you to think about this word pluralism, because what we see with the English colonies, where we have the Puritans up in the north with these strict rules, these strict guidelines being ruled by the Congregational Church. Then we have New York and New Jersey, Pennsylvania and Delaware that seem to have pretty big apprehensions towards representation and a representative assembly. but definitely more diverse, right? The middle colonies are extremely diverse of different backgrounds, different religions, different nationalities. And then we get the Chesapeake, which we have seen lots of indentures, all there for money, and eventually the incorporation of African slaves at this point. And then we get the South, which again is going to be pretty similar economically as the Chesapeake. African slaves having a higher demand for the incorporation of slaves, and we're definitely seeing a lot of development. So while the 13 colonies are all English colonies, the societies, the makeups are very diverse. And so I want you to know this word pluralism, this idea of a very diverse society. It's going to cause the communities in the English colonies to be drastically different from what the mother country is, right? The mother country of England. And so all 13 colonies have a very unique story, have very unique settlement, have very unique colonists, which is going to cause the cultural makeup to be just extremely different from England. And so when we think about this, because we're going to start moving in towards that time period where the English colonists feel just very disconnected from back home. Okay, so we finally made it. We got our 13 colonies, and now we're going to move on to just understanding how these 13 colonies developed economically, socially, and then politically when we start to get to the brink of revolution. All right, y'all, it was great talking to you. If you have any questions, obviously just ask.